Hey everyone, welcome back to Realpolitik. Today we're going to be talking about the latest developments in Ukraine for March 24th, 2023. So let's get right into it. So there's a lot going on all over Ukraine. There's a potential Ukrainian amphibious assault across the Dnieper into the Kherson Oblast on the east side of the river. That's something people are talking about. There are Shahed 136 or Garan 2 drone strikes in Kryvyi Rih. They have hit multiple targets apparently, and a Su-35 or multiple Su-35s have dropped bombs on targets in the Sumy region. So there's a lot going on, but we're going to talk about the most important event right now in Ukraine. The most important announcement in the last 24 hours is coming out of Bakhmut, and it's coming from the mouth of Yevgeny Prigozhin. I hope I'm saying that right. So whether you like him or hate him or love him or whatever, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that when the guy speaks, he usually just speaks the truth. He usually makes claims about Wagner. He's the head of Wagner, right? And he usually makes claims about Wagner taking over a settlement, and he makes sure to be 100% sure that they've taken the settlement and are in full control before making any claims. So he's pretty reliable, and he's saying that Ukraine currently has 80,000 troops in and around Bakhmut, and they're about to launch a counteroffensive. Now, this is very significant, and if we look at the deployment map, we will see that in Bakhmut, if you just count the number of brigades, and each brigade is around 2,000-3,000, so there could easily be 80,000 Ukrainian soldiers in and around Bakhmut. And then in Avdiivka, you've got another situation in Avdiivka, and what you have happening there is that in Avdiivka, just compare the number of brigades. The one here, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then there's like dozens in Bakhmut, right? So Bakhmut seems to be the focus for Zelensky and his government. Now, the Americans have asked Zelensky to leave Bakhmut alone, to conserve his forces and focus on the main task at hand in Zaporizhia, right? That's what the Americans want the Ukrainians to focus on. Zaluzhny, the head general in Ukraine, has also apparently asked to withdraw for his forces from Bakhmut, but Zelensky is sticking to his primal instincts. He doesn't want to let go. He wants to double down and send reinforcements. Now, the Americans want the Ukrainians to focus on the big picture, and they want the Ukrainians to go ahead with the master plan to basically launch a massive counteroffensive in the Zaporizhia Oblast and establish a massive salient, making it all the way to the coast. Maybe they'll take Mariupol, maybe Berdyansk, who knows, but they want to establish a salient, and then once they establish the salient, they want to hold on to it, and from there they can use the HIMARS, hit the Crimean Bridge, and then from there they would ideally attack Crimea, right? Now, how feasible is this, considering that the Russians, I mean, a lot of people will point to Kharkiv, the Kharkiv offensive, the Kherson offensive, September last year, but during that time, the Russians they were suffering from what you would refer to as a manpower deficiency issue. Right now, they don't have that problem. Just look at this article from the New York Post, not the most reliable source in the world. I mean, it's not as credible as New York Times or something, but still, their sources are American and Ukrainian sources. So, Russia amassing 500,000 soldiers, almost 2,000 tanks to launch offensive in 10 days. This was more than a month ago, but they never launched the offensive. But according to intelligence, along along the border in the north, right here where you're seeing these artillery strikes and the Su-35 strikes, and along Sumy Oblast and Kharkiv Oblast, they might be actually softening it up for an offensive, because according to the Americans and Ukrainian sources, the Russians have hundreds of thousands of troops just sitting here, just waiting for the order to go ahead. Now, why haven't they gone ahead in the winter offensive? What are they waiting for? Maybe they're waiting for the Ukrainians to deplete themselves out first. Who knows? That remains to be seen. But in Bakhmut, Zelensky is definitely doubling down, and the Wagner PMC private military company are expecting a Ukrainian counteroffensive any day now. Recently, the ground has been very muddy, but they're hoping in the next couple of days it's going to harden, and then they could send the vehicles forward. Now, 80,000 troops, I mean, this is just a staggering number of bodies, of soldiers, right? And they're going to have to go forward in waves, because if you do the math, 80,000 divided by 6, let's say 6 person per SUV or truck, or however they want to transport them, on average, let's say 6, that's a fair number. Then that would mean that the Ukrainians would need over 13,000 trucks or SUVs to transport all these men at once. So I don't think they're going to transport them at once. What we saw in Kherson last year was they would transport them in, from point A to point B, from a staging ground to point B, and then back to point A, pick up more soldiers, drop them off, and then on, rinse and repeat. But, this is not Russia from September. The Russians are full-blooded. They're ready. They have reserves. And right now it seems that although in the last month there was a lot of activity in the Bakhmut region, there was a lot of progress, especially in the north. And the noose really seems to be tightening. Really, it did seem to be tightening, and it has been tightening, but now there seems to be the gains seem to be very slow and incremental, right? Fighting in a city is never easy. Now, the 2 roads that are left in and out of the city are under Russian fire control. There's this road that you see in yellow to the south, and this other road right here. I'll draw it out so you can see it. So there's this road right there, and these are just so close to the Russian lines. The Russians are well within rifle range, if not physically in control of these roads. So sending reinforcements and supplies to Bakhmut is going to be difficult. The main thrust for the Ukrainians is probably going to come from this MO3 highway and towards Krasnohora, and then from the south they might also try to get onto this road right here, the TO513, and move their way east. And then ideally what the Ukrainians would want to do, if they could do this, is they would want to get to this intersection you see right here and encircle the encirclement. That would be an immense achievement, but can they do it, or will the Wagners beat them back? It seems that, according to some reports, the Wagner assault units are now focusing on digging in. They're setting up their minefields, their foxholes, snipers with armor-piercing rounds, ATGMs that can hit targets up to 5 kilometers away. They've got their Lancet drones. So the Russians seem to be prepared, and the Ukrainians, again, I don't think they're going to come all at once. I don't think I don't think Zelensky has an extra 13,000 vehicles in his back pocket. I think they're going to come in waves. And what the Russians ideally want to do, the same as what they would want to do anywhere else, and also in Zaporizhia, is get them into a bottleneck and use their artillery superiority to completely annihilate them. And the Russians are whether you like it or not, the Russians are firing 10 times as much artillery as the Ukrainians right now as we speak on a daily basis. And according to some sources, this war will one way or the other end by the summer because the Ukrainians are not really conserving their artillery, and the Western powers have offloaded all of their excess ammunition. Their stockpiles are now depleted, and there's just a limit to that. It takes time to, build up your industry, and the U.S. doesn't even have enough ammunition if they want to go to war with China, or even like on the scale of Iraq. Apparently they don't quite have enough ammunition for that. They need to replenish their own stockpiles. And the Ukrainians, the amount of ammunition that is being used in this war is mind-boggling. Like, thousands of rounds fired every day. It's just mind-boggling. But in any case, in Zaporizhia, what the Russians have done, not only is it not going to be like Kharkiv, where the Russians, and Kharkiv and Kherson, where the Russians had a manpower deficiency issue, but also if you recall, in Kherson, the Ukrainians focused on striking the bridges across the Dnieper, right? So that reinforcements could no longer flow through. They could only trickle through. And then the Russians made the tactical decision to tactically withdraw from the west side of the bank. So the Ukrainians focused on the bridges, and then when the Russians went across the bank, they completely destroyed the bridges themselves. Now there's some word about the Ukrainians potentially launching amphibious assaults, but amphibious assaults are never easy. Every single one the Ukrainians have launched towards, for example, Enerhodar to retake the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, something like half a dozen times. They failed each time with several hundred troops, like 200 or more each time, with speedboats, with transport ships. They've tried it and it's failed. And along this peninsula, they've tried landing. Again, the Russians have counterattacked. It's failed. It's difficult to get heavy weapons across when you don't have, all the resources. And if the Ukrainians were to stage such an operation, the Russians would see it coming also, right? The Russians have satellite intelligence. You have to keep that in mind. So this war is not easy for either side. Now, in Zaporizhia, the Russians have 3 lines of defense, okay? It's not going to be like the Ukrainians are not just going to be able to waltz in like they did in Kharkiv. The Russians have set up 3 lines of defense, and these lines include, in this diagram you can see, there are tank traps, there are dragon's teeth, these concrete blocks that act like basically barriers between the tanks, like a physical barrier. The Russians have dug into the earth. They've dug defenses into the earth. They have earthworks, trenches, tunnel networks, pillboxes, ATGM, sniper ambush squads, you name it. So it's not going to be easy for the Ukrainians. And obviously, through these kind of defenses, there's always going to be a way through. It's like a maze. There is going to be a way through. The Russians are going to know that predetermined route. The Ukrainians can guess. They might hit minefields on the way. And eventually, what the Russians would want is for the Ukrainians to fall into a trap, to basically go all in a straight line, like a choke point, like a bottleneck. And then the Russians would have artillery set up, and they would know those coordinates offhand, and then they would annihilate the Ukrainians. That would be the Russians. That would be the plan that they would have. That's the way they would want it to ideally play out. Now, for the Ukrainians to go on this offensive in Zaporizhia, for them to establish a salient to the coast, not only establish a salient, past all these defenses, but to hold on to the salient and send supplies down and everything and avoid Russian counterattacks, right? I mean, that's a tall order. That's not going to be easy for the Ukrainians to do, because the Russians are constantly going to launch counterattacks. The Russians might activate other fronts in Avdiivka. We see what is happening. It's turning into another Bakhmut in Avdiivka. If I can go there, give me 1 second. So basically, I'll get rid of all this, just 1 second. So in Avdiivka, you have another pincer developing now. Some will claim that this bulge here isn't really as extensive, isn't really as far as this shows. But the Russians have definitely, in my opinion, reached the railroad. The railroad is the main supply line into the town. It's now been cut off. There are 3 roads to the west. One is right here, and then there's another road right there, and then there's this road right here. So the Russians might have, if this map is correct, which many are doubting, there's conflicting claims, but keep in mind this is a pro-Ukrainian map, but the Russians could be close to cutting off one of the roads, as well as they're at least, apparently they were on the western side of the railroads, but now they're on the eastern side of the railroad tracks. But still, they physically control the railroad tracks. They can use their artillery. It's within rifle range. So using this railroad is not, the Ukrainians just can't do it, right? So they're now having to resort to using these roads. And if one of those roads is cut off already, I mean, we're looking at like, 5 kilometers, 3 miles in between the pincer closing. So this is turning into another Bakhmut. And, all along the front, as I mentioned earlier, there's clashes. And apparently even towards Seversk, the Russians have recently made some gains right around here. So they've broken through there apparently. In the forests here, there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of footage that the Russians have put out of them killing Ukrainian soldiers and taking over their trench lines. And the Russians in the north are inching towards Kupiansk. The Ukrainians have already began evacuating people. There is activity. There are clashes all along the front, but it's really incremental gains here. But the Russians are realistically 10 kilometers, 6 miles from Kupiansk. So if they activate here, and if they have hundreds of thousands of troops across the border, they could activate these front lines. So the question then becomes, can Ukraine commit to Bakhmut, and then will afterwards, if they are able to free up Bakhmut, if they're able to, I think they can, 80,000 troops is not a joke. They might definitely be able to undo a lot of the progress the Russians have made in the last couple of weeks, right? And, in the end, they might send the Russians to a line like this or something, who knows, something like that. But at what cost? After that, will the Ukrainians be too depleted to work on the salient in Zaporizhia, which is really what matters in the long run, in the grand scheme of things, because, that's the land bridge between Crimea and the Donbass, right? You break that land bridge, that's like shattering Putin's plans, right? And then if they make it to the coast, the Ukrainians could obviously use HIMARS and, other kinds of systems to constantly hit the bridge. Would it be feasible for the Russians to then hold on, right? So who knows? We don't know what's going to happen, but this war is getting really exciting, and I'm going to be keeping track, and I'm going to keep letting you know what's happening day to day. And anyways, guys, if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. These videos take time. Anyways, comment if you agree or disagree with me. Share this video with your friends, whoever, with your boyfriend, girlfriend, gay friend, everyone. and I will see you guys in the next one.